Francis was threatened. The hidden truth behind his final speech, a silence that screamed the world was preparing for yet another ceremony on the Vatican's agenda. As so many times before, cameras lined up in St. Peter's Square. The faithful waited with rosaries in hand, and Pope Francis prepared to deliver one of the most anticipated speeches of the year. But something was different. His face showed a tension that contrasted with his usual serenity. His voice, though firm, vibrated with a restrained tone, as if he carried within him a message he feared to reveal completely. The words flowed, one after another, like a river held back by an invisible dam. It wasn't what he said that caused alarm. It was what he didn't say, what he hinted at, what he hid between the lines. That brief and seemingly harmless speech would be remembered not for its message, but for the consequences it unleashed. Something had changed, and soon rumors began to circulate. Francis had been threatened, and not by external enemies, but by shadows closer than anyone could imagine. What truth was the Pope about to reveal? What documents remained locked away on his desk, unpublished? Why were several private meetings abruptly canceled after that speech? In this documentary, we won't just trace the facts. We'll follow the signs, the gestures, the silences. We will delve into the hidden corridors of the Vatican, the internal tensions that many prefer to deny, and the personal battle Francis fought between faith and fear. Get ready to uncover a story that disturbs but cannot remain hidden. Because when the loudest voice of the Church hesitates, something truly serious is at stake. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel. Leave a like if you believe the truth must be heard, and comment below. What do you think Francis was trying to say in his final speech? This journey is just beginning, and what you are about to discover could change your view of the Church forever. The Pope of Hope in a fragmented Vatican when Jorge Mario Bergoglio was elected the new Supreme Pontiff in 2013. The Catholic world celebrated what seemed to be a historic change. Francis not only represented a new era for the Church, but also a different style. Humble, approachable, revolutionary in both words and gestures. From his first statements, he made it clear that his vision was not to continue the traditional line of power, but to bring the Church closer to the people, to open the Vatican's doors to transparency, and to make faith a path of truth without fear of conflict. Yet what began as a breeze of renewal soon clashed with the marble walls of a centuries-old institution accustomed to resisting change. Inside the Vatican, not everyone applauded his style. Some considered him dangerous. And gradually, the image of the people's pastor transformed into that of a leader walking a tightrope, surrounded by fickle allies and invisible enemies. During his early years, Francis promoted structural reforms, such as the audit of the IOR, the creation of commissions to investigate historical abuses within the Church, and outreach to marginalized communities. But every initiative met resistance. Reports were blocked, committees dissolved, documents mysteriously disappeared from his desk. There were even rumors that his private correspondence was intercepted by unknown hands within the Curia. Behind closed doors, some cardinals expressed their discomfort with the Pope's proposed openness. It was a mere theological disagreement. It was fear of losing privileges, fear of buried secrets coming to light. And while Francis tried to advance, the walls closed in around him. Despite it all, the Pope remained firm. He smiled in front of the cameras, embraced the poor, visited prisons, and washed the feet of the marginalized. But privately, according to those closest to him, he began to show signs of exhaustion. His gaze became more distant, his voice more hesitant. At night, he spent long hours writing in a diary he never allowed anyone to read. Some aides said he would talk to himself, murmuring phrases in Latin as he walked the Vatican corridors. He grew more reserved, more silent, and in that transformation, suspicions arose. Was he being watched? Was he receiving internal pressure? Was someone inside the Vatican trying to silence him? No one could prove it, but everyone felt it. The Pope, who had come to change everything, now walks surrounded by shadows. The pastor's dreams and the palace shadows in the months leading up to his final public speech. Pope Francis began to experience what he himself described, in confidence, as disturbing dreams and nameless signs. These were not mystical visions like those attributed to popes of centuries past, but dark, recurring images that haunted him at night. In them, He wandered through empty Vatican corridors, heard doors slamming behind him, and felt the constant presence of unseen eyes behind shattered stained glass. In his most personal words, collected by his private confessor in unofficial notes, he stated that he was not afraid for his life, but for his soul. When truth becomes such a heavy burden that silence feels like mercy, he wrote on an unsigned piece of paper, that's when fear disguises itself as obedience. No one fully understood what he meant, but those close to him knew he was deeply troubled. Parallel to these personal anxieties, strange events began occurring in his immediate environment. His personal doctor was replaced without explanation. One of his most loyal aides was suddenly reassigned to a remote diocese. Scheduled visits were canceled at the last minute, and certain documents he was supposed to review vanished mysteriously before reaching his desk. At the same time, he was asked to soften the tone of his social messages. Some of his speeches were edited by curial members before being delivered, under the pretext of avoiding misunderstandings. Although the Pope had full authority to override these decisions, he began to yield, perhaps out of strategy, perhaps out of warning, perhaps out of fear. To the outside world, everything seemed normal, but inside the apostolic palace, tension was palpable, and it wasn't political tension, it was existential. It was during this time that Francis secretly began working on a personal text. It wasn't an encyclical. It wasn't an apostolic exhortation. It was a letter he intended to read aloud at his next public address, in which he would lay bare certain truths that had tormented him. It was said, he provisionally titled it Letter for Silence. The exact content was never fully revealed, but those who read it claimed it contained direct phrases about the urgent need to cleanse the church from within, even if it hurts. This letter, according to confidential sources, was read by only 3 people. One of them allegedly warned that its publication would be a doctrinal bomb. Days later, the Pope decided to alter his plan. Instead of reading the letter in full, he would weave its essence into a shorter, more symbolic, and far more dangerous speech. Because sometimes what remains unsaid weighs more heavily than 1,000 words. The speech that was not meant to happen the morning of the speech arrived under a strange atmosphere. The Vatican woke under gray skies, and although the square filled as usual, movements inside the apostolic palace were unusually tense. Several members of the papal team were informed of last-minute logistical changes. Press access was restricted. Certain areas of the Vatican were closed off, and unexpectedly, the number of cardinals allowed to attend was reduced. No one said it openly, but everyone felt something was wrong. Francis, according to close witnesses, was quieter than usual that morning. Unlike other occasions, he didn't joke with his aides or greet visitors warmly. He simply walked, slowly, from his residence to the place prepared for the address. In his hand, he carried a folded white envelope, which he handed over to an aide only seconds before stepping onto the podium. Inside that envelope was a final text of a speech that would change the course of his papacy, and according to some, might have cost him more than just prestige. What the world heard that day was not an attack, nor a direct accusation. It was something more subtle, more profound. Francis spoke of forgiveness, as he had so many times before, but this time he linked it to the idea of betrayal. He spoke of mercy, but pointed to silence as a form of violence. He spoke of power, but with unusual bitterness, mentioning that the true enemy of faith does not always come from outside. He did not look at the crowd with his familiar warmth, but with an intensity that seemed to pierce through those present. Throughout the speech, he deliberately omitted parts of the prepared text, improvising phrases in a reflective tone, as if trying to say something more between the lines. Cameras caught him trembling at the end of his address, and instead of returning to his usual seat, he exited through a side door, escorted by 2 security members who were not part of his usual detail. That image did not go unnoticed. Something was definitely wrong. The most disturbing part came hours later. The official video of the speech was edited before being uploaded to the Vatican's institutional channels. Some key phrases were cut out, and, according to accredited technicians, the live transmission was intentionally delayed by several seconds, something highly unusual for papal addresses. Additionally, the official transcript normally published in full on the Vatican's website, appeared with noticeable modifications compared to what was actually said. Some crucial passages were missing. That same night, 3 journalists who had requested interviews with the Pope were informed that their credentials were being suspended for internal reasons. No explanation was given. No one dared to ask. But in private circles within the Curia and among academic Catholic groups, an old, heavy word began to resurface: censorship. And with it, a new rumor: the Pope had been threatened before he spoke. And his speech was a carefully veiled response to that threat. Voices in the shadows. The days after the silence after that speech, which marked the before and after his papacy, the Vatican seemed to sink into a strange, tense calm. For the next 48 hours, there were no official statements, no interviews, and no public appearances by the Pope. Press bulletins were replaced by generic messages about prayers and reflection. Inside the Vatican walls, however, unease was palpable. Several members of Francis's close circle were swiftly reassigned in unusually rapid moves. Conversations were held in whispers. Open meetings were avoided. And even the body language of high-ranking officials reflected discomfort. One of the pontiff's personal aides confidentially commented that she had never seen the Pope so withdrawn, so visibly watched. It wasn't fear he showed. It was a blend of resignation and clarity. He knew that, with his words, he had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. Meanwhile, outside the sacred walls, interpretations of his message multiplied. Some progressive theologians asserted that it was a denunciation of internal resistance to the Pope's reforms. Others, more conservative, accused him of sowing division within the Church. But there were those who, reading between the lines, detected something far deeper, a coded plea, a call for help hidden within spiritual rhetoric. When the shepherd can no longer protect his flock, he must speak even if the wolves are listening, was one of the key phrases omitted from the official transcript. This line, recalled by several journalists who were present, does not appear in the Vatican's official record. It was erased. But the testimonies agree. He said it. And that tiny detail opened the door to a new hypothesis. Was the Pope asking for help indirectly? Suspicions intensified when, a few days later, an anonymous letter was sent to an Italian media outlet with close ties to the Vatican. The sender, identifying himself as an internal witness, claimed that Francis had received a verbal warning 3 days before the speech, during a private meeting with a group of influential cardinals. According to the letter, he was clearly urged to moderate his language to avoid unnecessary crises of faith among the faithful. The letter included no names, but the level of detail about Vatican procedures made it impossible to ignore. The media outlet chose not to publish the full letter, but confirmed its existence. Meanwhile, the Vatican maintained total silence. No denials, no confirmations, only a growing sense that the Pope was not alone. But neither was he truly safe. The written truth that was never read, it was not the first time Pope Francis prepared a message only to end up saying something entirely different. According to internal sources, the original text he planned to deliver on that historic morning was much more direct. It didn't mention names but referred to very real events. Internal reports that had been blocked, decisions reversed without his authorization, and high-level meetings from which he had been excluded. In one of the preliminary drafts, read only by 3 trusted individuals, there was a striking phrase: the institutionalization of silence as a mechanism of spiritual power. This line, they say, was underlined in blue ink. Francis apparently intended to make public what many knew but few dared to say, that even the Church can sin from within when fear the truth is disguised as pastoral prudence. That document, according to later leaks, was stored in a folder marked private, not for publication without final papal review. However, after the speech, that folder disappeared. Some members of the Vatican archive claim they never saw it enter the official protocol. Others suspect it was removed by one of the Pope's oldest aides, who was transferred to a nunciature in another country shortly afterward. The original document was never published, and although fragmented versions have circulated among independent theological circles, their authenticity has never been fully confirmed. Nevertheless, the excerpts, especially those mentioning the psychological pressure endured by the pontiff, have been enough to cause many to reinterpret his final speech. What seemed like another reflection turned out to be a failed attempt to scream the truth. The Pope knew his words would be revised, edited, softened. That's why, according to his closer collaborators, he chose to hide the real message not on paper, but in his tone, his gaze, his silences. The official text was a mask. The real communication was encrypted in the way he paused on certain phrases, the way his lips tightened when he spoke of forgiveness. It was nonverbal language, a form of communication that only those who truly knew him could decode. And perhaps that was his only way of defending himself. He couldn't say everything, but he couldn't stay silent either. That's why his speech was both a word and a silence, a truth and a shadow. And it was within that ambiguity that many finally understood. The Pope had been forced to yield, but he didn't surrender without leaving a trace. Echoes of the silence cry the days following the speech were not peaceful. They were filled with unease. Inside the Vatican, certain movements of the Pope began to be restricted. Scheduled visits were canceled, and his closest aides noticed that his movements were now accompanied by security personnel he had not authorized. Although nothing was officially communicated, the sensation was clear. Francis no longer had full control over his agenda. Some attributed it to his physical fatigue, others to precautionary measures. But those who truly knew him immediately understood something different. He was not withdrawing willingly. He was being isolated, and in that isolation, his voice grew quieter outwardly, but it still burned fiercely within. During a private Sunday Mass shortly after the speech, he reportedly told a small group of confidants, "When you lose the freedom to speak, you lose a piece of your soul." Meanwhile, beyond the sacred walls, the echoes of his message continued to grow. On social media, theologian faithful followers and critics alike analyzed every word, every pause, every omission. Some saw in his speech a veiled warning about internal conflicts. Others interpreted it as a disguised cry for help. Speculation intensified when a former Swiss Guard member anonymously published a testimony claiming that the Pope had received unregistered nighttime visits before the morning of his speech. The Vatican, as usual, gave no response. Silence was its only answer. But this time, silence was no longer a shield. It became a confirmation. The international community began to ask questions. Who was pressuring the Pope? Why was he not allowed to speak freely? What truths could be so dangerous that they required silencing the highest figure of the Church? Accredited journalists were denied permission to ask questions about the speech. Scheduled interviews were indefinitely postponed. Official channels repeated the narrative that everything is proceeding normally. But no one truly believed it anymore. Far from weakening, the Pope's figure grew stronger. His silence spoke louder than any encyclical. His lonely figure at the Vatican window, waving no greetings during those silent afternoons, became a symbol of resistance. And for many, in those dark days, a new image was born. That of the Pope as an institutional martyr, a man cornered simply for trying to tell the truth. The invisible network. The power that cannot be seen throughout the centuries. The Vatican has been a stage for intrigues as complex as those of any imperial court. But few have dared to speak of the existence of an invisible network, a web of influence, favors, silent pacts, and unspoken agreements operating far beyond official documents. This network doesn't wear visible cassocks nor sit in public audiences. It acts from closed corridors, private archives, and unnamed offices. And it was within this delicate web that many believed the threat that silenced Francis was woven. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't an explicit message. It was something far more unsettling, a warning without words, delivered through gestures, sudden disappearances of trusted allies, and the subtle reassignments of key witnesses. The Pope didn't need written proof to understand it. His pastoral intuition, forged in the slums of Buenos Aires and sharpened in ecclesiastical power halls, was enough to know he was being cornered. Some analysts point to a small group of high-ranking prelates, members of historical Vatican congregations, who had viewed Francis's reforms with suspicion from the very beginning. His outreach to the marginalized, his crackdown on financial corruption, his firm stance on clergy sexual abuse, and a proposal to decentralize certain papal powers were seen by some sectors not as renewal, but as direct threats. In private meetings, Francis was often labeled as too political, too popular, or even dangerous to doctrinal stability. And while his popularity among the faithful grew, his room to maneuver within Vatican walls shrank. In that context, every word he spoke became an act of courage, and every silence a survival strategy. Leaked reports after the speech revealed that urgent meetings were held among cardinals from different countries. The content of those meetings were never made public, but witnesses claimed discussions included institutional limits to papal authority and doctrinal containment strategies. The expression doctrinal containment doesn't appear in canonical law, but those who heard it knew exactly what it meant. It was not about protecting faith. It was about protecting structures, about preventing Francis's message from sparking a movement that could no longer be controlled. And in the midst of it all, the Pope, aging, frail, increasingly isolated, continued writing. His private notebooks, they say, still hold reflections no one has yet read, because the invisible network does not only act to silence, it acts to bury, and as it operates, it does so in God's name. The echo of the final speech, when truth cannot be buried months past, and Francis's speech faded from mainstream news. But among grassroots communities, humble parishes, alternative theological circles, and attentive faithful, the echo continued to resonate. Those carefully chosen words, weighed down by silence, became a symbol of something far greater. The struggle of a man who, from the pinnacle of spiritual authority, dared to suggest that even the church itself needed redemption. He didn't shout it. He didn't denounce anyone openly, but he left signs. And today, those signs are studied almost like sacred passages. In online forums, some have begun to call that message the invisible cross of Francis, because what he carried was not just a millennia-old institution. It was the burden of knowing he was limited by those who were supposed to uphold him. The questions remain open. What exactly did he mean to say? What was he not allowed to reveal? Why has no one inside the Vatican addressed the rumors of his isolation? Where are the unpublished documents? And who are those hidden behind the silent network, watching from the shadows? Maybe we will never have all the answers. Maybe history, as it so often does, will try to close this chapter with a blank page. But as long as his figure continues to provoke questions, as long as his gaze lives on the eyes of millions who saw in him a wounded but unwavering shepherd, his message will not die. Because true power is not in structures, it is in conscience. And Francis, though silence in words, left a conscience burning, still alive at the margins of faith. This video does not aim to accuse or pass judgment. It aims to invite you to look deeper, to not settle for what is visible, to read what was left unsaid. Because if the most human pope of modern times was forced into silence, what hope remains for those still dreaming of a free, compassionate, and just church? Share this video. Subscribe to the channel if you believe faith must walk hand in hand with truth, and leave a comment. What did you feel when you heard his final speech? Do you believe he was silenced? Or did he speak louder than anyone dared to interpret? Your voice, like his, might just shake the walls of silence.